Tanse, everyone. Welcome to Sacred Spaces, Knowledge Keepers and Storytelling. And today our special guest is Bobby Gonzalez. And I would like to invite everyone on Facebook. If you do have questions, you can type them into the comments under the video and we will get to them at the end of the event. Bobby Gonzalez is a nationally known multicultural motivational speaker, storyteller, and poet. Born and raised in the South Bronx, New York City, he grew up in a bicultural environment. Bobby draws on his Native American, Taino, and Latino Puerto Rican roots to offer a unique repertoire of discourses, readings, and performances that celebrates his indigenous heritage. Hello, Bobby, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I am going to hand the floor off to you. And let me know when you want me to share the video and I will do that.
Thank you, Tanis. Do you hear me?
I do, loud and clear.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to this program. For many of your audience, when they hear the word Taino, they scratch their heads. They say, Taino, what nation is that? And we are the people who discovered Columbus. The man was lost, but that's another story for another day. And our traditional homelands include the islands of Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, Cuba, and the Bahamas. And often when I go on my lecture circuit during the Q&A, I'm often asked, Bobby, are there any pureblood Tainos left? And my reply always is, pure blood, full blood, half breed, quarter breed. Are we talking about people or are we talking about horses? This blood quantum idea was brought over by the Spanish for the first time, and it's a completely foreign one to us. So I want to begin the program with sharing with you a video that I made a few years back of me performing a story, a Taino story entitled Matu the Manatee. So Tanis, if you can share that, please.
Will do.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Bobby Gonzalez. I am a Taino storyteller. The Taino are the native people of the Caribbean Sea. We were the ones who encountered Christopher Columbus back in 1492. Now that encounter changed us and it changed the entire world. We Taino have many stories, some of which are hundreds of years old. We have stories about great leaders, brave warriors, and wise women. We have stories about how the sea was created and how we came into this world. Today, I want to share with you the story of Matu the Manatee. Now, back in the old days, we Taino often went fishing out in the Atlantic Ocean. And sometimes our fishermen would go after the fish with spears. Sometimes they would use a bow and arrow. But more often than not, they would simply toss a net in the water, pull it up, and they would find fish. Well, one day, this Taino man went out into the ocean in his canoe, and he tossed the net in the water. And when he pulled it up, he didn't find any fish. What he found in his net was a little baby manatee. And he decided not to kill the manatee. He took him home. Naturally, a manatee has to live in water. Now, across from the man's house was a large lake, a large body of water. And he put the baby manatee inside the lake, and he gave him a name. The name was Matu. And every morning he would call out to him, Matu, Matu. And Matu the manatee would come out of the water. And the Taino man would give him all kinds of Taino food, like the sweet potato, the batata, the corn, maisi, or the pineapple, yayama. And every day different people would take turns feeding Matu the manatee. The Taino man, his wife, his children, and Matu the manatee grew up to be of an immense size, over 10 feet long, weighed over 2,000 pounds. Well, he was so big and strong that Taino men used to jump on his back and he would give them a ride across the lake. And one day it is said that 10 big, strong warriors jumped on his back, and with ease he gave them all a ride across the lake. One morning, someone called out to him, Matu, Matu! And he thought to himself, oh, great, breakfast. And out he came, but it wasn't a Taino who had called out to him. It was one of the men of Christopher Columbus. And this man was starving. He hadn't eaten in a week. So instead of feeding Matu the manatee, he threw a spear at him. Now the manatee has very thick skin, so the spear just bounced off. But even though he wasn't hurt physically, his feelings were hurt. So after that happened, whenever anyone would call out to him, Matu, Matu, he would simply stick his head out of the water. And if the person was dressed from top to bottom, he went back in the water and said, not again. But if the person was nearly naked, he said, Taino, and he would go out and get his breakfast. Well, one day, a hurricane hit the island of Haiti. And it rained for days and days, and so much water came down that all the waters of the lake went out to the ocean. And Matu the manatee went out to the ocean and went to see his mother, who he hadn't seen since he was a baby. And no one ever saw him ever again. Now, that story of Matu the manatee is a very important tale for Taino people. We pass it on to our young ones to help impress upon them the importance of keeping the old ways alive. And we remind the little ones that the best way to honor their ancestors is to listen, to remember, and to pass on these same stories to their own grandchildren. Wakia Taino, Wakia Yahabo. We are Taino. We are still here.
Thank you. Okay, Tanis, that story is more than 500 years old. I didn't make it up. And I've dedicated my life to searching out stories, but also following native protocol. If someone tells me a great story and I ask, can I pass it on? Sometimes I'm told, no, you can't. And if they say yes, I thank them and give them some tobacco. One example is a little known story about the aftermath of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. I was told by a Pueblo man, he's from Santo Domingo, Pueblo. They reassumed their original name, I think it's Kara. I'm not really sure how to pronounce it. Well, anyway, he told me that after the victory at Little Bighorn, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho sent out riders in all four directions to spread the news. And this Pueblo man told me that one of the riders arrived down in New Mexico to Santo Domingo, Pueblo to share with them the news. Wonderful stories. And we Taino have many of our own stories that have been passed on. But sometimes to fit contemporary times, they've been modified somewhat, keeping the spirit alive of the story. A friend of mine who passed away recently, George Crespo, wrote a children's book about the Taino origin of the sea. Now, before we get to share that story, I have to show you something. Because in the story, there is a gourd, a calabash. And many of you live in the city, you don't know what a gourd is, a calabash is. Well, this is a gourd, and the fruit tastes very bitter. You can't eat it. So very often, indigenous people will cut open the gourd, throw out the fruit. Sometimes they feed the fruit to the pigs, dry it in the sun and make cups, food bowls out of it. My grandfather told me that where he grew up in the country, there were no barbers. So they would take big gourds like this and cut the boy's hair. From the gourd, my Taino ancestors also made the maraca. That's a gourd. By the way, maraca is not a Spanish word, it's a Taino word. Also, gourds come in different shapes and sizes. And from some gourds, they would make a guido, or you call a scratcher. And that's made out of a gourd. You see where they cut it off here, made holes in it, got the meat, the fruit, and dried it in the sun. So, the story of the creation of the sea. A long time ago, there were three people in the family, the mother, father, and son. The father was called Yaya, the mother Itiva, and the son was called Yaya El, which means son of Yaya. And one day the boy told his father, "Father, I'm going to go off into the forest and hunt for food." And he went with his bow and arrow. And father said, "Well, be careful." So Yaya El began walking through the forest, and he looked up and he saw birds flying in a circle. And he said, "Uh-oh." And he walked a little bit more, which he shouldn't have. And he looked up and he observed the clouds are coming down low, very low, almost to the ground. And he said, "Birds flying in a circle. Clouds coming down low, almost to the ground. That means only one thing, a hurricane, a huracan. I better get back to the village." But he was far away already. Meanwhile, back in the village, all the people of the Yucayeke, the village, went to take shelter inside a big cave. But outside the mouth of the cave was the father yelling out, "Yaya El, Yaya El." But there was no response, so we had to go inside the cave for shelter. And inside the cave, the people could hear all the noise of the hurricane outside, the wind, the rain. And the rain kept coming down for 2 days. And finally, after 2 days, the storm subsided. And the people slowly stepped out, and they saw the trees blown asunder, their bohíos, their houses all blown away. And Yaya rather went to look for his son. Yaya El. He walked to the woods, looked all over, couldn't find him. And then on the ground, he found a bow and arrow. And that's when he knew that his son had perished in the storm. So he went home And he showed his wife Itiba, our son Yaya El did not survive the storm. Here's his bow and arrow. Now, the Taino of those days had a custom. Sometimes they would take the bones of their ancestors or dead relatives and put them inside a gourd and hang the gourd from the ceiling. So he had a big gourd, and Yaya put the bow and arrow inside the gourd and he hung it from the ceiling. And every time he or his wife Itiba would want to reflect on the sun and reminisce, they would bring down the gourd and take out the bow and arrow and go, oh, and then put it back. Yaya and his wife Itiba had a conuco, a garden where they grew food, but it was a couple miles outside of the village. So they went out one day to go harvest their crops, their foods in the garden. And while they were away, 4 boys snuck into the house. And they looked up and they saw the gourd hanging from the ceiling, and they wondered what that gourd was. And they brought it down and they tipped it over, and 4 fish came out. And the boys were hungry, and they barbecued the fish, had a great and delicious meal, but they were a little greedy. They took the gourd down again and tipped it over again, and 4 more fish came out, and they cooked and ate the fish. But then they heard some noise outside. Yaya and Itiba were returning from the conuco. One of the boys said, "We gotta put the gourd back." But he was clumsy. He tried to put the gourd back, but the gourd fell down and crashed on the ground, and all this water came out. Water, water, and more water. And Itiba, the mother and the father Yaya, and all the people of the village, there was so much water, they climbed up the nearest mountain. They climbed to the top, and the water started rising up and up. And finally, the water stopped rising. And the people looked around, and the mountain was now an island surrounded by water. And they saw in the water, there were all kinds of fish: big fish, small fish, gray fish, black fish. And then they realized that this great flood was a gift from Yaya El from the other side, so they would never go hungry. And once a year, on the same time, the Taino people of this village would have a great big areito, a ceremonial gathering celebration, an expression of gratitude for Yaya El for giving them the gift of food and making their island, Borinquen, Puerto Rico, an island. And that's the story of how the sea was created. Now, the original sea story was about the island of, as we know today as Dominican Republic and Haiti. And that island had several names: Quisqueya, Bohio, or Haiti, Haiti, which means high rocky country. And as I travel, I pick up stories that I told you. But I really like gathering stories from the native people of so-called Latin America. I ask people in my presentations, where do most natives live? And I hear, oh, they come from the plains. No, the Southwest. No, the Midwest. I said, wrong. More than 90% of the native people of the Western Hemisphere live in so-called Latin America. So depending on one survey you read, there are 40 to 50 million indigenous people in Central and South America and the Caribbean. So very often they're not Spanish. So some of the immigrants who come here from so-called Latin America can't even speak Spanish. They speak their indigenous tongue. So one story that was passed on to me, it was passed on from the Aymara people from Bolivia. And it's called The Skunk Who Fell in Love with the Moon. We are told that once The skunk was looking around and he looked up at the moon, and the moon was full and bright, and he fell in love with the moon. And still to this day, people fall in love when you see a full moon. So he asked, I gotta go up there and tell her how much I love her, but who's gonna take me? So he asked all his animal and bird friends, can someone take me to the moon? Please, one of you, take me to the moon. Now, he lived up in the Andes Mountains, and all the animals and birds told him, none of us can climb or fly that high. There's only one bird that can fly that high, and that bird is the vulture. Now, when he heard that name, the skunk got a little nervous, because the vulture can be a very intimidating bird. But he gathered up his courage and he walked over to a vulture and said, hi, Mr. Vulture, how you doing? And the vulture said, what do you want? Vulture said, oh, I want a little itsy bitsy tiny favor. And the vulture said, what's that? Can you fly me up to the moon? And the vulture said, fly you up to the moon? I don't want to fly you anywhere. You stink. And the skunk says, I won't do any stinky stuff. Please, please, take me up to the moon. The vulture thought for a moment, and he said, okay, I'll take you up there, but no stinky stuff. And the skunk says, I promise, I promise. So the skunk jumped on the back of the vulture, and the vulture spread his wings and flew up in the air higher and higher and higher. But the higher he flew up in the air, the skunk got dizzy and dizzier and dizzier because, as you all know, there's hardly any air up there in space. So finally, the vulture, after a long flight, landed on the moon. Boom. And now the skunk really couldn't breathe when he told the vulture, oh, brother vulture, thank you for flying up to the moon, but I can't breathe. Take me down to earth, please, please. And surprisingly, he kissed the vulture on one cheek like this. And now the vulture again spread his wings and he flew all the way back down to earth. Boom. And now the skunk was on earth. He could breathe nice and easy. Oh, he was so happy. He said, thank you, brother vulture. Thank you for so much. I'll see you around. And he kissed the vulture on the other cheek. And he walked away. Well, I'll tell you the truth. Within a couple of days, the skunk forgot all about the moon. He fell out of love with her. But the vulture was never the same. So when you get a chance later on, even on Google, you can look for a picture of the vulture. And you'll see on the vulture's face 2 black marks, where a long time ago, the skunk kissed him with his dirty nose. I have a few skunk stories. That was one of them. But I once performed in a little club. We had a storytelling festival. And I performed a story, The Skunk Who Farted People to Death. And some of the older folks in the audience were, oh, how could he tell such a story? Oh. So I finished it and I sat down. The next storyteller came up and shared a tale of how he and his friends went to visit a medicine man for a spiritual weekend retreat. And it was very intense, very heavy. And on the last day, the medicine man said, listen, we've had a very intense weekend. It's time to let ourselves relax and have a good laugh. So let me tell you a story. And the medicine man told the story of the skunk who farted people to death. And the people who just a few minutes ago had gone, they were saying, all right, maybe it's not a bad story. Yep, we have a lot of stories about Taino, especially of our leaders. Now, our leaders are called caciques. Male or female, we call them caciques, because a leader could be a man or a woman. And women, at the time of the encounter, were political, economic, spiritual leaders, occasionally even military leaders. And Columbus and his men found that very strange because women had a lower, level of respect in their society, but we respect our women. Now, one famous cacique was named Atuey, Hatuey, and he came from Haiti. We pronounce it IT, kind of rocky country. And the Spaniards came, and he led the war of resistance in Haiti. And of course, he had a rough time resisting because we Taino had our bows and arrows, our spears, we had darts, and they had swords, guns, killer dogs. What killed most of it was disease. Smallpox, yellow fever, malaria. So we had a tough time resisting, which didn't stop us from doing so. So Atuey was in Haiti, and he said, okay, we have to escape. And he and his followers went on a fleet of canoes, and they traveled in a westward direction to the island of Cuba. Now, the word Cuba, we're not sure what the word means. That's been lost in time. Maybe we'll recover it soon. So he landed in Cuba and led the war of resistance there. He resumed his title of cacique, of leader. However, he was finally captured by the Spaniards and was condemned to be burned at the stake. So Atuey was tied to the stake and ready to light him up. And then suddenly he was approached by a priest with a Bible in his hand. And he said to Atuey, Atuey, do you want to be baptized and go to heaven? And Atuey asked, are there any Christians in heaven? And the priest says, that's all there is. And supposedly Atuey says, well, if they're in heaven, I'd rather go to the other place. Light me up. And they lit him up and burned him to death. And Atuey is still a leader, an esteemed leader among the people of Cuba today, a symbol of brave resistance. Now, another leader from Haiti was Anacaona, a woman. And we're told her name translates into flower of gold. Now, she married Caonabo, who lived in what's today called the Dominican Republic. But he died, so she went back to her original home, Haiti. And there her brother was the Cacique Becho, but he passed away. And Anacaona, this wonderful woman, assumed his position as chief, cacique. And she tried to live in peace with the Spaniards, but it didn't work out. She tried to appease them, but finally they called for a meeting of all the chiefs and sub-chiefs of her region, and they all met in this one big longhouse. And the Spaniards set fire to the longhouse, and all these people, these leaders were killed. The one who was spared was Anacaona, but they spared her only to hang her. So I wrote a poem called Anacaona. She sits on the earthen floor, her wrists and ankles threaded by iron chains. She sits motionless, absolutely still with her eyes shut tight as her breath comes and goes in long and measured flows. She is the poet queen of IT. And now she squats alone, all by herself in a hut, chained in darkness, with only the damp floor of Mother Earth to comfort her. She begins to release tears that fall to the ground like offerings to the great bleeding mother, La Madre Tierra, Itiba Kaobaba. She cries tears of sorrow for a daughter who will not have a mother to teach and to love her. She cries tears of sorrow for the children who will now have to endure a life of cruel enslavement. And she cries tears of anguish for the earth of her island that will no longer be tenderly cared for by the only people who are sensitive to her ways and to her needs. And then she begins to hum, and then she begins to chant. She chants the poem song that had been sung on the morning that she was born. She chants the poem song that had been sung on the day she became a woman and was given a new name. And she chants the poem song that had been sung on the day when she felt the labor pains that seemed to tear her body apart. And then she began to sing and cry with joy, knowing that she will soon be walking in the radiant spirit land where the ancient ones dwell. But for now, she sits alone on the earthen floor of a hut, her wrists and ankles fed by iron chains. She sits, waiting to be hanged, and the blood of the moon in the sky turns blood red in anger as the poet queen squats on the earthen floor, waiting to be hanged. Anakaona. Anakaona. Yeah, that's my most requested poem when I do open mics, which I haven't in a long time. I've done a couple of virtual open mics, but it's not the same flavor. And I travel a lot on the college circuit. Before the pandemic, I used to say, I've been to 42 of the 50 states, and before I finish this journey, I'll do all 50. Well, if I do all 50, it'll be online virtual. And the education, the enlightenment, and the stories when I travel. I went to the University of North Dakota, and I stayed there for 3 days. And one day, I gave a lecture, and upon the end of the lecture, a young Lakota man approached me and said, "Mr. Gonzalez, I want you to know that we prepared a sweat lodge for you." And I said, "Uh-oh." And I said, "Thank you, young man, but I cannot accept your offer as quickly as it is." He says, "Why not?" He said, "Well, I said, first of all, the sweat is not my people's tradition. And number two, I've heard about your traditional Lakota sweats. I'll probably last 5 minutes and yell out all my relations and run out the door." So I passed up on that. Next evening, this is in Grand Forks, North Dakota, I emceed an open mic. What I didn't know is they had never had an open mic at the University of North Dakota. And when it was finished, a couple of poets told me that they had driven 3 hours each to read 2 poems. And they were so happy. They said, "We should do this more often." Well, I've hoped they continue this tradition since then. Yeah, traveling from school to school. Well, I've been to Minnesota a few times. And in one presentation, I spoke about the American Indian movement and the civil rights movement of Native people. And a young lady said, "Mr. Gonzalez, I want to join AIM." And I said, whoa, wait a minute. I suggest that you do your research on the American Indian movement and then make up your mind if you want to or not. And I asked her, "Have you ever heard of John Trudell?" She says, "John who?" And I said, "Oh boy, you have a lot of homework to do." And I went to one school in Minnesota, St. Olaf College, and almost all the students were blonde with blue eyes. And I gave them to talk about indigenous people. I said, "Most of you probably have indigenous heritage." And they said, "How's that?" I said, "Well, in Scandinavia, there are so many Sami. You may know them as Laplanders, and they still speak their language, live the old ways." And they said, "We never heard of them." And the professor assured me that the following week they would have a Sami speaker come to the school and share with them stories of their own indigenous culture. So it's not uncommon at these international indigenous gatherings where you see these blonde-haired, blue-eyed Sami people. But of course, with global warming, they're having a hard time preserving their culture and their ways. Now, I went to one school in Minnesota, I won't say the name, and I had a talk with the president of the Native American Student Club. And he was Dakota. And I was intrigued. I said, listen, if a member of the Crow, a student of the Crow Nation approached you about membership in the club, would you consider it? And he was quiet for a minute and said, maybe. And I said, oh boy, some of us still hold on to our old animosities. But that changed with Standing Rock. Many, many nations who are at odds with each other for many years, sometimes centuries, came together. And there was a healing. Now, another school I went to was the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, UNLV. And I was surprised when the door opened, I'm ready to give my presentation, and all these Diné people walked in. I think they bought a Diné community center, and there were natives, Diné people, Navajo of all ages, very young and the elders. And I gave my presentation, and one of the young men made a criticizing statement about my lecture. And as soon as he finished, an elder stood up and said, we apologize for this young man's rudeness. We know you have come here a great distance to share your message. I'm very sorry. And I learned about protocol. And I especially saw non-native people. We have a lot of protocols. Last year, I was at a conference of Native Americans. They said, before we begin the discussion, we have to follow Native American protocol. Don't interrupt anybody. And went down the line. And then they said, if you point at somebody, point Indian way, like this. And I said, I've been doing it my whole life in the South Bronx, and I didn't even know it. Speaking of the Bronx, more than once I've been told, we've never heard a Native American storyteller with a Bronx accent. I think the first time I heard that was from Louis Mousy from the Thunderbirds. I did a show with them. And I said, well, we come with all kinds of accents. And if you know Ty Defoe, ask him. He imitates me perfectly with my Bronx accent. So I said, Native people come from all over, all kind of accents, all kind of languages. And I went to the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And the event was getting up there, almost 22 hours between all the layovers. But I met Inuit, Yupik, and since they're right there, I said, what do you think about this Bering Straits theory that we first came in from across the Bering Straits from Asia? And I was told, we call that the BS theory. And every nation has its own origin and migration story, but many Native people say that we came from here and nowhere else. Now, what I like is when I enter into a circle of Native storytellers, you never hear anyone say, oh, you're wrong, your story is wrong. This is our story, it's the right one. No, if someone has a different point of view, you see, oh, that's very good. Thank you for sharing that with us. And then I went to the University of Mississippi. And being from New York City, I was a little nervous about going down there. And I walked through the front gates of the university and I said, well, that's progress. In my youth, I wouldn't have been allowed to walk through the front gate. And I gave a presentation on Native peoples, and I was surprised, pleasantly surprised to hear that on campus, there was an ongoing discussion about Black Lives Matter at the University of Mississippi. I said, times have changed. Some people want to turn back the clock, but we've made this progress. We're not going back anymore. I do a lot of storytelling for children of all ages, and that's an education in itself. I was in one school, and during the Q&A, a student asked me, Mr. Gonzalez, was Columbus as bad as they said? And I looked at the teacher, and she crossed her arms defiantly, and I said, oh boy, I gotta be careful here. Tell the truth, but yet be careful. So I said, young man, as you grow older, read different books. Read books that tell you that Columbus was a bad guy, and read books that tell you that he wasn't so bad. He was a great guy. And then you read both books, and you draw your own conclusions. And the teacher uncrossed her arms. Now, I encountered the opposite attitude at another school. Again, elementary school, 6th, 7th graders. And a young man asked me, Mr. Gonzalez, what did the Pilgrims do to the Native peoples when they arrived here? And I looked at the teacher, and I gave her a certain look that she would immediately, she says, tell them the truth. They have to learn sometime. I said, okay. I said, okay, children, the Pilgrims were grave robbers and slave traders. And they said, what? Yeah. That's something they didn't tell you in Peanuts Thanksgiving special. When they first landed here, the Pilgrims were starving. They had no food. So they dug up the graves of the Native people. And many of the bodies were wrapped in blankets, and they took the blankets to keep warm. And they were food offerings. And they would take the food, a lot of it was corn, and cook it and eat it. And then I asked the children, why did the Pilgrims come to America? And they said, religious freedom. Right. And I said, well, once they arrived there and got settled down and comfortable, guess what they began to do? They began to deprive Native people of the religious freedom. And the Wampanoags, the Pequots, or the people of that area say that it was either become a Christian or be put up against the wall and shot. Of course, some natives resisted. Those natives who resisted were sold into slavery and shipped down to the Caribbean. Many of the Wampanoag were sent to the island of Bermuda. And now every year, there is a family reunion. Wampanoags from Massachusetts go down and travel to Bermuda and have a reunion with their distant relatives, and they have a powwow. I guess now it'll have to be a virtual powwow. Well, one funny story about an encounter with it was a young girl about 10 years old. And she asked me, Bobby, were there any rats and roaches here? And I said, no, they came on Columbus's ships. And she said, that figures. So we had a good laugh after that. So it's good to have a laugh even when we talk about hard facts, hard times. Now, I've been hosting and organizing Native American festivals in the Bronx for over 25 years. And it goes like this. How did this all begin? It began unintentionally. The universe, presented it to me. I was a member of the Bronx Council on the Arts. I was a writer, storyteller, and I asked one of the members of the Bronx Council, can you arrange a meeting with the parks department so I can put on a native event? He said, sure. So we met Bronx Council of the Arts on one side, Parks Department on the other. And I thought, oh, we'll have a poetry reading, we'll arrange that. I said, Mr. Gonzalez, let's have a powwow. And I said, oh boy, okay. All right, well, first of all, let's not call it a powwow. Let's call it a Native American festival, because when you have a powwow, again, you have to follow certain protocols. And with a festival, it's much more open. And we had our first powwow in Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx, which is ironic. We were on the grounds of the Van Cortlandt House Museum, and goes back to the mid 1700s. And of course, the original owner had slaves. And at least a couple of the slaves were natives. What their names were or what nations, we don't know. We do know that one was called Caesar, because his name was in the will of Frederick Van Cortlandt. So we had this, who was the drum group? It was the Drum Circle Singers. And we had artisans selling their wares. And one year we had a brother from Connecticut, Mixerson, come in with his band and play Afro-Algonquian jazz. And Van Cortlandt Park has a rich history, rich Native history. Some of it is dark. During the Revolutionary War in the 1770s, there was an encounter between a contingent of Stockbridge Munsee people and Hessians, who were German mercenaries who were on the side of the British. And the Stockbridge Munsee were on the side of the Americans, colonists. They had a battle, and unfortunately, over 40 Stockbridge Munsee warriors were slain. But the Hessians departed from the battlefield without properly burying them. Well, a couple of days later, local farmers found dogs chewing from the bodies of these Stockbridge Munsee people, and they buried all the remains. And that burial ground is still there in Van Cortlandt Park. However, we're not exactly sure where the burial ground is. They put up a plaque, but the original plaque was put up not at the actual burial ground, because they knew it. They put a plaque on the actual burial ground. Someone will come live at night with a shovel and dig up the graves, but they're still there. So we started up in Van Cortlandt Park. Then we moved it to Pelham Bay Park on the east side of the Bronx. And now the drum group was the Drum Circle Singers. But every year we'd have different performers. Matu Little Eagle, Powhatan Swift Eagle, Chin, Reggie Caesar, a whole lot of people from different nations, Ika Mateo from the Taino. And we had a bigger space, so we had more vendors selling American arts and crafts. And now we could offer fry bread. Oh, yes. But last summer, I helped organize and host a most unusual Native festival. This took place on Hunts Point and Southern Boulevard, out in the street. This was done through the auspices of Casita Maria, a community center in the South Bronx. And we got access to a big portable stage. We had drum circle singers. We had Marie Ponce doing her hoop dancing. And all these people from the community came out to the street and joined in. And we had a couple of friendship dances. We even had a group of indigenous skateboarders. So we had something for young and old. But following the Silver Cloud Singers was a Garifuna group. Now the Garifunas are sometimes called Black Caribs. They're from the Lesser Antilles, islands like St. Vincent, Dominica, other islands, originally populated by Caribs. By the way, the Caribs were not cannibals. It's a story the Spaniards made up as a pretext in order to enslave them. So you had all these Caribs. The Spaniards brought enslaved African people who intermarried with the Caribs and formed a whole new people, the Garifuna or Garifuna and Black Caribs. And then many of them were forcibly relocated to Central America, to Honduras, Belize, and they performed these Garifunas at this native festival on Hunts Point. By the way, there are now 150,000 Garifunas, Black Caribs, living in the Boogie Down Bronx. Why? I don't know. So now we're having virtual Native American festivals. 6 months ago, I didn't know what Zoom was. Now I can't get off it. So about 5 years ago, we started another series of Native American festivals at Fordham University. And this year, we're gonna make it different. We have a virtual festival, no frills. Basically, it was me and Ty Defoe, a great buddy. And next year, who knows what's going to happen. But where did my journey begin? Well, I think I'm going to have to start off my next presentation with that story. But first, I'll just let you know the site of my world-changing, the world changing my life, dramatic change. There was a library in the Bronx, it's still there, but it's a little bit different, called the Huntington Free Library. And at that time, it was the research library of the Museum of the American Indian. They had over 40,000 books on Native peoples, some dating back to the 1500s. And this was the 1980s, so what you would do is come in after you made an appointment and you look through the card catalog, no computers. It was really backwards. Go through a card catalog, make out a call slip and say, please bring me this book. And they'll go to the back and get the book and bring it out to you. So I said to myself, I gotta get back to you. I want direct access to the book. So I asked, do you need a volunteer? It says, sure, just fill out these papers and you can start right now. So I signed the papers, gave him a volunteer, and went to the back, and I had direct access to 40,000 books on Native history and literature, some dating back to the 1500s, where I wore out that photocopy machine. But that collection is no longer there. As you might know, the Museum of the American Indian was taken over by the Smithsonian. And they took away most of the museum collection down to DC. And they wanted the books as well. And New York said no, we lost the museum collection, we're not gonna lose the 40,000 books as well. So there was a big battle. Who's gonna get the books? The New York State Museum, Historical Society rather, in Cooperstown, or Cornell University in Ithaca? Cornell won. So if you want to read any of those books, you have to take the long drive up to Ithaca or to Cornell. People tell me, Bobby, it's a shame those books are no longer with us. I said, well, when you had a chance, I never saw you up there. But that museum, that library rather, opened up all these doors for me. By the way, one thing I learned, reading a book from the 1500s is no picnic. Some of the authors didn't believe in paragraphs. So I'm broken paragraphs for pages and pages. Some of them didn't believe in punctuation, no commas or periods. and try and read 16th century Spanish, even if you can read 20th century Spanish. Oh boy, so, but I learned a lot and I met a lot of people. But I'll share that with you in my next presentation because got some wonderful stories about the Huntington Free Library and beyond. So, Tanis, are there any questions for me? I hope so.
Yes, there are a couple. I will just hop over here and scroll back. We have one that is actually going to be answered in your next session because it's about your journey. So we will hear that then. We do have a question from Yagawehene Oaks, and she asks, do you write your own stories, contemporary stories possibly?
I have several poetry books, but people have asked me, Bobby, when you come out with a nonfiction book or come out with a book of stories? My wife expresses always on my case. It's a new year, need a new book. Yeah, I think I'm overdue, but I want to make them contemporary, not just stories about my people back in the 1500s, but how we have survived today and how we have accommodated ourselves to contemporary society. Like I said in one story earlier, I told the Lakota young man in North Dakota, sweats are not my people's tradition, but many Tainos now participate in sweats, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think I passed, but yes, I think I'm overdue for a book of stories. Thank you.
Wonderful. I actually tagged Ty Defoe when you mentioned him in the comments and let him know that we must see his impression of you at some point now. And so Ty wrote Bonjour Bobby in the comments and also asked when was the exact moment that you knew you were a storyteller and or the exact moment you knew you needed to do the work that you do?
Well, again, for my next session, when I didn't become intentional, I didn't intend to have powwows in the Bronx. It just happened. I didn't intend to become a storyteller. I was given an opportunity to perform at the Museum of the American Indian in Manhattan, in the Upper West Side. It was on 155th Street. And what happened that day was, it's the first time I ever performed in public. And really start, and a TV crew comes in. I said, who are these people? And they were a crew from a Spanish language TV station called Buen Dia Nueva York, Good Day New York. And said, we're going to film you. And I said, oh boy, with my limited Spanish, we'll give it a shot. Good thing it wasn't live. Once in a while, I would say, cut. ¿Cómo se dice esto en español? All right, shoot, and go back. But I'll tell you the name of the person who opened that door for me in my next session. But it was because of the Huntington Free Library, and doors were open to me, and I became a storyteller. And I really developed my storytelling skills when I worked in my family's bodega. It's a grocery store in the South Bronx. And because once you step behind the counter of a bodega, the show begins. And this last summer at the museum, was it last summer? I'm losing track of time. The summer before, at the Museum of the American Indian, they had an installation, a Taino one, Kunuko Bodega. Kunuko is the garden, the farm, and a bodega, modern bodega. And they said, who can we bring in to do storytelling? They said, there's only one Taino bodega storyteller, Bobby Gonzalez. So I did Taino bodega stories. That might be a good angle for the storybook. Let me think about that.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Bobby. What a wonderful way to spend a Sunday afternoon. We will definitely be looking forward to your next session, and we will let everyone know when that's going to be. It'll be on a Sunday, perhaps even next Sunday, if you're available. We'll follow up. So thank you. Hi. Thank you so much, Bobby. And thank you everyone for joining us on Facebook. And if you liked what you watched today, please consider making a donation at aich.org/donate. The American Indian Community House is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization serving the needs of Native Americans residing in New York City. We were founded in 1969 by Native American volunteers as a community-based organization mandated to improve the status of Native Americans and to foster intercultural understanding. So with that, I will say, please enjoy the rest of your Sunday and we'll see you back again. Your next session, Bobby, I think we could invite people to join us on Zoom, perhaps, if you like, or we can, yeah, so we'll post that information for everyone on Facebook and we can have a more interactive session with hearing about your personal journey. Thank you, everyone.
All right, take care. Talk to you soon.